All right, welcome everyone. I'm so proud of you for making it to day 3 on the electron transport chain, also known as the ETC. This is the final step in aerobic respiration. So if you remember at the beginning, I told you there was 3 steps. Today you're going to learn about step 3, and this is also going to teach us about the overview of cellular respiration. We're going to try to put all the pieces together. So the first thing I suggest is thinking about what is the purpose of the Krebs cycle. And if you guess metabolism and energy production, that's correct. So remember, our original goal was to break down this acetyl-CoA into citric acid, and then that citric acid got further broken down into energy in the form of ATP, NADA, and FADA2, and you can see that on both sides. The second thing I want you to think about is what are the 2 main molecules we need from the Krebs cycle to move on to the next step? And I mentioned these are probably the 2 most important molecules produced from the Krebs cycle. If you guessed NADA and FADA2, then you're correct. Those are the 2 most important ones because these guys are going to bring high energy electrons to power the next stage. So the main function of the electron transport chain is to make ATP. So in this stage, almost all the ATP is made, and it's really the king of ATP. So if you look in the previous steps that we've done, we used the glucose and glycolysis. We made a little bit of ATP. We also produced a lot of all the carbon dioxide in the intermediate reactions in the Krebs cycle, but we haven't used the oxygen. We haven't produced water yet, and we don't have very much ATP. So I did notice there's a little mistake here in the blue for the ETC. It should read 34 ATP. I was writing kind of fast. So make sure in your notes that you adjust this to 34 ATP. But the electron transport chain makes the most ATP of any stage. So if you think about the whole purpose of cellular respiration is to make ATP, it wouldn't be very impressive if we only had made 4. So that 34 added to the 4 gives us a lot of ATP, and it makes a little bit more sense. As you can see, it also requires oxygen, meaning that it is an aerobic process. So here's basically what happens in the electron transport chain based on the chart. And then like usual, I'll show you the word version. So all the NADA and FADA2 from this Krebs cycle, the intermediate reactions, and even the NADA produced in glycolysis, all of those NADAs and FADA2s are going to carry high energy electrons and drop them off at the electron transport chain. These electrons are going to move down the chain, and as they do, they're going to release protons, H+ ions. And those protons are going to be used to pump through and form a molecule of ATP, and it just does this over and over and over again. At the end of the chain, oxygen is the final electron acceptor. That's why we need oxygen to do this step. And once the oxygen accepts those H+, it's going to become H2O, which is water. So that's where the last step comes in. Now, the electron transport chain is very complicated. So I'm really just giving you the short version, but here it is again in words. So NADA and FADA2, those are our high energy electron carriers, and they're going to bring the electrons to the chain. When they drop the electrons off, this releases protons, which are H+ ions, hydrogen ions, that power an enzyme called ATP synthase. The root word synthesis means to make, and the root word at the end, ase, means we're looking at an enzyme. So ATP synthase is an enzyme, ase, that makes synth ATP. So ATP synthase makes ATP by converting ADP to ATP. So it's kind of like a little rotor, and the protons go in, and it spins, and it pops out ATP. And then, like I said, at the end of the line, oxygen is waiting to accept the remaining protons to become H2O or water. So this is what it looks like. And again, I'm giving you the very simplified version, but you can take a look. So here, NADA is dropping off the electrons. You can see the little E, and it moves down the chain through all these different proteins. And as it moves down the chain, it's releasing these protons, H plus ions, hydrogen ions, into the intermembrane space. And as it does that, those protons are going to go into this ATP synthase enzyme, and again, it's going to turn and add phosphate groups to ADP to make ATP. So those protons are kind of like the power for the ATP synthase. Then you can see the pink electron line. It's moving down the chain, down the ETC, until they reach oxygen. And oxygen, if you remember from the water unit, is really good at pulling electrons towards itself. And at the end, once the electrons reach that stage, the protons are going to get added to the oxygen, forming H2O or water. So taking a look one more time, you can see here, I usually just draw it pretty simply like this, the NADA and the FADA2, and technically this NADA and this NADA2, they all bring electrons to the ETC, which forms ATP, and then the oxygen is the final electron acceptor, which then accepts the electrons and becomes water. So just a couple quick reminders from the cheat sheet. The function of the ETC is to make ATP. So again, almost all the ATP is produced in this stage. It takes place in the inner mitochondrial membrane of the cell, or of the mitochondria. And what happens during that phase is that NADA and FADA2 give up electrons to make ATP, and oxygen is converted into water. So 2 simple steps, or you can explain it with the steps on the previous page. In order to complete this reaction, we need NADA and FADA2. They come from the Krebs cycle and bring the electrons to the chain. ADP is needed so that it can be converted to ATP, and we also need oxygen to accept the electrons at the end of the chain. And the remaining products, when this is all done, is about 34 ATP and water. So quick little review, what are the reactants of the ETC? Hint, there are 4. If you guess NADA, FADA2, ADP, and oxygen, you are correct. What are the products of the ETC? Hint, there are 2. If you guessed about 34 ATP and you also guessed water, you're correct. And where in the cell does the ETC take place? If you guessed the inner mitochondrial membrane, you're correct. So we want to talk now about how the electron transport chain is related to all of the other steps of cellular respiration. So if you remember from the beginning, this was our equation. C6H12O6 plus 6O2 gives us 6H2O plus 6CO2 and about 38 ATP. And we looked at this picture at the beginning where we saw glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm. The Krebs cycle and the ETC happen in the mitochondria, but you can kind of see from here the most important reactants and products in this reaction. So we start glycolysis with glucose, which then ends up giving us 2-pyruvate and 2 ATP and 2 NADA. The NADA are going to be saved till the end to bring electrons to the ETC. To get into the mitochondria, the pyruvate needs to go through the intermediate reaction where we end up getting 2 acetyl-CoA and 2 NADA, which again are going to be used in the ETC. The acetyl-CoA moves on to the Krebs cycle where it starts the Krebs cycle, which produces 2 ATP and lots of NADA and FADA2, which are going to move into the ETC. And then the ETC in the end produces ATP. So there's a lot of intermediate reactants and products here that don't end up getting shown in this final equation because they get used up. Like you can see the NADAs and the FADA2s get used in the ETC. Pyruvate gets used in the intermediate reaction. Acetyl-CoA gets used in the Krebs cycle. But the ATP is good to go. So that's one of the things we get to keep. And so are these other products, which we'll take a look at in a second. So here's a picture of the whole process showing how much ATP is produced from each stage. As you can see, we get the most coming from the ETC. And the total amount of ATP produced by aerobic respiration with oxygen. Let's take a look. So from glycolysis, we get 2 ATP. From the Krebs cycle, we get 2 ATP. And from the ETC, we get 34. So if we add all these up, 2 plus 2 plus 34, we find out that we actually get 38 ATP produced by cellular respiration. So that's why I added this in the product. So this is the big picture of the equation. And again, this blue one right here should read 34 ATP, so that when you add all three up, it equals 38. But you can see I color-coded the reactants and the products and the overall equation where they're used and produced. So purple is glycolysis. We use glucose, and we produce 2 ATP. The NADA and pyruvate are not shown because they are used again in the next step, the intermediate reactions, which is color-coded in green. In this one, we don't have any reactants because the main reactant is pyruvate, but we produce CO2 and NADA. But that NADA gets used again in the ETC, so we don't see it in this big equation. Then the Krebs cycle, the main reactant is acetyl-CoA, but it's not shown here because it gets used and broken down into citric acid, which then gets broken down into ATP, NADA, and FADA2. So you can see the ATP shown here in red, 2 of them. But we also then use that NADA and FADA2 and all the other NADAs in the ETC to drop off the electrons. That allows the ETC to make about 34 ATP. So make sure you fix this blue one. It should read 34 ATP. And the oxygen is required at the end of the ETC to accept those electrons, and that ends up producing water. And so that's how everything fits together. So hopefully that helps you put all the pieces together a little bit more. So once you finish this lesson and you've taken your notes, you can once again take a look at the graphic organizer, which is here. So again, in the center would be the ETC. And the reactants, the products, where does it happen, the function or definition. You can list the steps, and then we'll continue to do this once we're all together in a review. And then again, for the draw it, you can draw anything that reminds you of this topic. One funny story I have is when I taught this lesson over COVID, I had a student turn in a giant 8.5 by 11 picture of Joe Biden's face. And I was very confused because I was like, well, I tell them they can draw whatever helps them remember, but I don't understand why you drew Joe Biden or why you printed out a picture of Joe Biden. And then I realized over Zoom, this student thought that the whole time I was saying the election transport chain, and it is the electron transport chain. So since I'm delivering this lesson over Zoom, just make sure you know the electron transport chain. After you finish this one, you can take a look at Model 3 on the POGL, which is on the electron transport chain. This is number 14, and at this point, you should be able to go all the way down to number 22. Numbers 20 through 22 kind of work with what we just did, so you can see a little bit of how the NADAs and FADA2s help contribute to the total amount of ATP. And then number 21 is very similar to what I just explained, where we put all the pieces together. So really proud of you guys. I miss you a lot, but good luck. I know cellular respiration is a lot, but you've learned all of the steps now of aerobic respiration, and you should be very proud. So we'll see you next time.